think we've rescheduled the agenda, so I'm going to sort of close the morning, and then Susanna, who was going to be with me, is going to open the afternoon. So hopefully that keeps you all to time, and what is an extremely interesting, I think, already productive seminar can continue apace. I am very proud to be hosting the seminar today. Chris, Philip from Frank Bold are very, very good colleagues and advisors in my work. I'm delighted that the Cardiff Business School from my own country, the UK, is involved in all of this. I've been, as you've noticed, I hope, sitting and listening along with all of you for a lot of the morning. I'll be here for as much of the rest of the day as well. And so I've learned a lot already, and congratulations to all of you for taking part. I am proud as well that it's in the European Parliament. Welcome to the European Parliament, and here you are in the home of European lawmaking in a seminar which is about the purpose of the corporation. And I thought I'd start with a quote which is about the purpose of law to get us to focus. It says, "Law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and when they fail in this purpose, they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress." Said just over 50 years since his death by the Reverend Martin Luther King. I think we can say that the problem that today's seminar is designed to meet is that even though many companies would describe themselves in the intervening 50 years as part of the vanguard of trying to secure social progress, that company law, as it exists in the member states and for the European Union, has too often represented that block to social and now ecological justice and to the realisation of human rights. Now, in my contribution, I've listened and heard, and I think we've all heard this morning, many of the obstacles in company law from an academic point of view and also from a legal point of view. I want to give you 3 examples from a political point of view of how that arises in this place and prevents us making changes to law in response to the obstacles identified. But then I'm hoping that I can get you thinking over the lunch hour and bridge to a focus this afternoon which is much more about solutions rather than problems. And I want to suggest to you, again from my own world, the political world, 3 areas where I suggest we can use what we're talking about and we're talking about today in terms of securing further action in response. First, the obstacles. The first one that everyone knows, the well-known problem of silo thinking. So here in Europe, I've been working on issues for more than 10 years about corporate responsibility and pool accountability, and yet we've had, in a whole other area of the European Parliament and the European Commission, a area of work on corporate governance, and ne'er the two shall meet. And as has been said this morning, the definition up to 2009 actually made that certain, because it said CSR could only be voluntary, and therefore when we discussed the Commission's corporate governance action plan and the legislation that followed, we were debarred from being able to discuss issues of wider corporate responsibility and accountability. That did change though in 2009, partly I hope in relation to my work, partly certainly to do with NGO pressure. And I have to say, and I know a number of the officials, the fonctionnaires from the European Commission DG Internal Market are in this room and are following today's debate closely. I believe that change has really been cemented during the course of the life of this European Commission by Michel Barnier, DG and DG Internal Market, and that has been, I suppose, symbolised by the bringing forward of the proposal on non-financial reporting. And Beta, I'm actually slightly more optimistic than you said about us still being able to get agreement on that. Can I just say, we never in the world of lawmaking get the perfect answer, but I'm still very hopeful we can get a good answer and a compromise before the new European Commission and Parliament. I just hope actually that new commitment that we've seen to incorporate these wider issues of responsibility and accountability of social, environmental and human rights impact that Michel Barnier has been prepared to take on, that will be translated into the new European Commission, and that's a job for me and my colleagues to assist with your support in the course of the next year. A second example concerns that familiar word, justice, and the long-running campaign that many of you in this room have worked with me and me with you on over the years to say that human rights violations committed by European headquartered companies should be able to be litigated within Europe when access to justice is insufficient in the host country where the violation has taken place. And it comes to that problem of the corporate veil. I'm not sure I've been listening. Have I missed a reference to the corporate veil? But I think it needs to be tabled at a conference such as today, because it has been used to hide accountability for individuals within the company in what's, let's face it, and let's be clear, is not the way that we're going to regulate the mass of companies and what they do, but is going to refer to a small number of egregious human rights violations that take place by corporations in the world where we're sufficiently falling short. Now again, members of this audience will be aware that the Brussels I Convention provides a perfectly possible route for this litigation to be made in Europe, but the company is extremely nervous about this, and any attempt to clarify and strengthen that opportunity has always been resisted in this Parliament and in Brussels. Indeed, there was an attempt to water it down. Well, that also failed. But I am pleased to tell you today that DG Justice of the European Commission has chosen to take a renewed interest in this issue, which could be a small but significant step forward after many years of inaction. My third example concerns the way that business efforts to limit what many businesses call regulatory burden crowds out the notion that appropriate regulation can actually be a creative force that protects innovation, in this sense social innovation, and which helps open up new opportunities, not close them down. I cannot tell you how many times I have sat in rooms such as this and heard from business lobbyists that regulating CSR in any way would lead to minimalist one-size-all-fits approaches, compliance-led box-ticking exercises, that it would destroy their creativity and innovation in corporate social responsibility. But I do think we have succeeded again in properly qualifying some of those views over the years, partly because of the views of leading companies like Novo Nordisk, who are in the audience and speaking this afternoon, who recognise in their markets a much more mature and complicated relationship between regulators and regulated. We've also moved to advocating much more a principles rather than a rules-based approach in relevant legislation, which is arguably, at least in some cases anyway, more effective. And of course we've adopted the concept, and I was grateful to hear the reference to due diligence in the previous session, of a smart mix between voluntary and mandatory approaches embodied in John Ruggies' UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That idea of the smart mix is something now very much accepted by the European Commission as part of their own lexicon too. And all of that has enabled us to make more progress, not just on reporting, by the way, but also, for example, in relation to revision of the public procurement directives and in new transparency requirements for the extractive industries. Nevertheless, the intensity of that lobbying from business has put such priority on the so-called business case for social responsibility, the idea that CSR naturally in some way leads to greater profitability. And I freely admit, by the way, that I do use that as part of my own lexicon. I don't want to deny it to this audience, although there will be some who think I should. And I do acknowledge that in some ways that argument has entrenched rather than challenged a narrow obsession with short-term financial return. But I want to return to that point in a moment. So 3 barriers that I've identified: compartmentalisation, resistance to extraterritorial jurisdiction, where corporations breach fundamental rights, the lobbying against widening corporate liability. So that demonstrate that the current definitions in company law close down these important issues. Now let me suggest 3 more areas, debates, where I think we can inject this project into current and future political thinking. First, a point well made, by the way, by one of the questioners earlier this morning. Sitting in Brussels, but on my part, having had the opportunity to represent Europe in global CSR initiatives, it is important for this symposium to remember that there are different notions of the corporation globally, not just those ones that are adopted in Europe and in North America. I know from visiting Japan as CSR rapporteur that the notion of lifelong commitment to employees and to communities is a rooted part of business culture in that country. I know of going to India and talking about CSR and being politely told that the concept of trusteeship is actually a Gandhian concept, not one invented in business schools in London or in New York. And in China, the notion that private companies assist in meeting social need appeared to me less one of philanthropy and more one of societal expectation. Now, as economic power shifts in the world, emerging markets emerge, developing economies develop, there is every prospect that others will bring these other different notions of the corporation into the debates in international financial institutions, trade and other multilateral negotiations. It is a point that Europe could do well to consider now. Second, let me address my take on the stakeholder-shareholder debate and how far companies be better accountable to either or to both. You will note that current proposal on EU non-financial reporting explicitly takes a stakeholder approach in the explanatory memorandum, but appears to be silent between the two in the actual text of the directive. Still, nevertheless, I believe it represents a notable move forward in thinking at the European level. I also encounter this same debate when we talk about disclosure at the global level, being involved in both the International Integrated Reporting Council, which places a greater emphasis on shareholders and on investors, and with the Global Reporting Initiative, which has typically emphasised the multi-stakeholder approach. Yet it is important for us to remember that both organisations emphasise that they are not alternatives, and that sustainability indicators must continue to play a role in integrated company reports, and indeed will be enhanced by using them in integrated thinking by the business. Extending that argument into today's debate, I argue stakeholders and shareholders may not have identical information needs about the company, but we should be careful about saying that their information needs are mutually exclusive either. Indeed, I am persuaded myself that quantifying economic costs of unsustainable business practice remains a crucial part of winning the argument for a transition to a low-carbon world. We've made such progress from the Prince's Accounting for Sustainability project to the Stern report in my own country, the United Kingdom, through the TEEP initiative, to efforts in the UN, including in Rio, where I was present, to bring in natural capital accounting. I know some of you will say that such efforts will always fall short because of the externalities argument and because of uncertainties in assessing cost into the future. But my judgment is that the potential cost of climate change in particular, but of global level social disintegration too, is so great that this is too powerful an argument for us to jettison. Indeed, I was on a panel with Lord Stern only last month where he said that the cost of climate change was at the worst end of his predictions 6.5 years ago, and worse again. Don't mistake my argument. Fiduciary duty has to change. When my party was in government in my own country, we passed that UK 2006 Companies Act, in which fiduciary duty was redefined. It was amended, I quote, as only able to be achieved by taking due account of both long-term and short-term and wider factors. The idea that there should be a single fiduciary duty at all was challenged in the debates at that time. And I still find it absolutely absurd that in at least some notions of company law, the implication is that chief executive officers of companies have to be restricted to single objectives, when the reality is that every day, every minute, they are required to respond to many. For that reason, I do not argue that shareholder primacy should simply be replaced by stakeholder primacy. There is room for both. I want to suggest that it is absolutely right to seek to redefine fiduciary duty in European law, building on and doing better than what we tried to do in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, but also to express caution about seeking to abolish it altogether, not simply on the grounds of realism, but because I continue to believe that economic cost remains crucial to our arguments. And third, most of you will have been aware that there have been very significant moves in the G20, also the OECD, also with the involvement of the UN Principles on Responsible Investment, in which I've been involved, to find new frameworks to shift investors towards long-term thinking. Taking part in these debates, I am convinced that some of the elements are really helpful to us in terms of what we're discussing in this project. The call on asset managers to start really beginning to manage in relation to the company, the challenge to financial analysts to change the way they discount the costs of the future, the debate around specific new responsibilities for pension fund managers in particular, the new focus on the concept of stewardship, a debate around requiring boards to address their long-term sustainability responsibilities, developing new longer-term methodologies for executive remuneration, and the push for greater shareholder democracy. Not all of these are guaranteed to promote environmental sustainability or social justice on their own, but they can make a difference. This is a topical and salient debate at the international level, which is recognised by the European Commission, and one which is certain to lead to further initiatives. So in the context of today's debates, it's one that I suggest we need to address. But perhaps the biggest opportunity to use in these current debates, if we get it right, is that if, as Lynn said this morning, the current purpose of the corporation is to seek to maximise short-term financial return, then to put it mildly, recent evidence is it hasn't been very effective. Shareholders have suffered their worst returns in 80 years. In the 2 years after 2007, on the major exchanges, the value of shares dropped by an unprecedented 50%, slashing pension funds for a whole generation. The recovery on stock markets can't hide the fact that income levels remain well below trend levels compared to the previous decade, a $4 trillion deficit in the United States alone, which will never be recovered. And according to The Economist, shareholders in 2 out of 5 of publicly listed companies have seen their companies disappear altogether. Fundamental questions become possible in that context. Corporate governance is on the agenda, not just amongst you as experts in this room, but the wider agenda, as much as we're talking about financial service regulation. So being prepared to depart from the Anglo-Saxon model, redefining fiduciary duty, shifting investment towards the long term, exploiting a situation where it is generally accepted by those in business as well as those outside that corporate governance needs reform. Let me suggest that the answers we're coming up with in this purpose of the corporation project must be ones which Europe must incorporate for the corporates. Have a good lunch.